everybody doing? Yeah. It is weird. It looked like it was going to rain last night, and it looked like it would rain this morning.
Not supposed to.
It's not. Yeah, it's not supposed to.
Friday, the same thing. It got wet for a little bit, real wet.
Well, we got rained on down there Thursday night, some Friday morning. All right. Got to get back to figuring out where we're at. Verse 10. I thought we got to verse 10. Sitting down yesterday to just review what I had studied. It's been several weeks, so trying to review it, and I was like, I don't remember exactly where we got to. Yeah, we are in Judges 2, so verse 10. And so we're talking about the Israelites and how they have turned their backs on God. Of course, they did not do what they were supposed to do, and driving out all the inhabitants. And that's going to end up being an issue for them. And so really the first verse 6 through 10 is a focus upon the death of Joshua, which has already happened, but this kind of, as we talked about chapter 1 and chapter 2, there was some review of the book of Joshua. And so some of the events that happened had already happened by that point. But there was a review of that. And so then we get down to verse 10, it leads up to verse 10. It says, for we have heard how the Lord had dried, that's not right, is it? That's in Joshua. I am in the wrong book. I got to get right this morning. All right. Verse 10 says, when all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. And that's really just a key verse for this book, as we talked about a little bit in the introduction, because everything is a result of this. Really, two things in this chapter, this and the fact that they did not drive out the inhabitants. And so it tells us here in verse 10 that they did not know God. How is that possible? Okay. Yeah, their relationship, what all is involved with that. They knew who God was, right? Now, there was a point, I think about in the book of Exodus, when Moses went before Pharaoh, Pharaoh had said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? Well, he didn't know who God was. That wasn't this situation. They knew who God was. They didn't care.
Like we say, that everybody says, I believe in God, but they didn't believe God.
Yeah, did they know the work that he had done? They probably heard about it. I mean, you would have thought, as we talked about before, they were supposed to know. They were supposed to pass down the things that they had went through about the Red Sea, the wonders in the wilderness. They had to, observe the rocks that were piled up out of the middle of the Jordan River, and to remind their children of that. And so, to me, it's almost a failure upon the parents, because they didn't teach their kids as they should. Now, is it fully upon the parents? No, because the child still has a choice, and that generation chose to not follow God. They did not know who he was as in that relationship, and they didn't care about his works, and so they didn't follow him. You think about Eli and his sons. What happened with Eli and his sons? Okay, so he was faithful, and his sons were not. He didn't train them. He didn't obviously teach them like they should. They knew their job. They knew what they were supposed to do, and they knew how to manipulate it and do what they wanted. And so they knew, they were taught in that sense, but they weren't trained. I mean, think about that.
You think about it only took one generation. It's not like it's 3 or 4 generations down the road. It's one generation.
And that's the thing is, we are always at least, we could be at least one generation away from of the church completely going away. Apostasy is the word we use, but that's what it is, just one generation. All it takes is a failure upon the generation now, us as parents, grandparents, teaching our grandchildren, and then that generation will disappear. I mean, the church will dwindle. And I think that's what's been happening for several years, right? How many places do you hear that have closed up their doors? And we went to Memphis, and while we were down there, people talked about different places that they had been, or places they know of that have closed their doors because they don't have enough people. Part of that's people moving away. This area, there's not a lot of jobs, so people sometimes will move away, but it's partly, when you think about how many people's in this town, how many people's in this county, there's plenty enough to keep the congregation going. Thankfully, we are. But can easily go away. Yesterday, we were talking about a congregation that's in a town of several thousand, and there's only 12 people in that congregation. So, who's that fall upon? Whose responsibility does that fall upon? Okay, each member, yeah.
You can also look at it from the aspect of, in Acts chapter 2, there were how many millions of Jews there, and only 3,000 obeyed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's also, we have, so many thousand people in this county, but a lot of them have had the opportunity to hear,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just going to keep doing what they're doing.
We're never going to have the majority.
No.
We hear congregations. When we were in school, we went to a congregation out in, I think it was McMinnville. I don't remember. It was out in eastern Tennessee, and it was one of our supporters, and we went and preached there. And they were telling us that that county alone, there's over 50% of the members of the church. Over 50% of the people in that county are members of the church. There was churches everywhere. You could throw a rock at between some of the churches of Christ that were spread out throughout that county. And the one that we went to had over 300 people in it. And there were some that over 1,000. And it's a very big, city-wise town that we were in that area in eastern Tennessee. Now, is each one of those faithful to God? I don't know. But it's interesting to see that. We don't have that up here. But I don't feel like we're ever going to be in the majority. But we should have, there's plenty of opportunity, let's say that. And so it falls upon each person, but it also falls upon parents, right? As parents, we have the responsibility to teach our children and to set them up for the best that we can, and do what we can. But it also falls upon the elders. That's something we don't have here. Elders have a responsibility to look out for the flock, right? To make sure that they're being fed in the way that they should. It's something we haven't seen here because we haven't had elders. Hopefully someday we will. Each congregation should be moving towards that point. But elders, I think that was a failure of the leadership at that time. They let that generation do what they did, and to not be the leaders that they needed to be. And so we have a responsibility to teach and help build a foundation for our next generation. Think about the fundamentals. Was talking to a friend, another preacher, about how many congregations don't know just the fundamentals. What do I mean by fundamentals of Christianity or fundamentals of the Bible? Okay, basic things like what? Plan of salvation is about the basic you can get, right? You can teach someone the plan of salvation pretty quickly, and teach them of the truth, and they can understand their need for being a Christian, their need for following God, and that's basic, right? How many people know the steps of salvation, and where to go to look at it? The church. I think the church is basic, right? What the church is. The organization of the church, that's pretty basic. Evangelism, maybe some of the characteristics of God. Those are basics, but how many places do not know? How many people do not know those basic things? Bible characters, events of the Bibles, the books of the Bible. When we were in school, it's crazy to think that this would be a part of it, but we had an instructor. Every test we had to give, Caleb knows this, he was in school. Every test, huh? We did it first and second year, but we had every test that instructor gave, the books of the Bible, in capital letters. That was the difficult part. Try writing the books of the Bible and then write it in capital letters. And then you had to do the 5 steps of salvation with verses, the acts of worship with verses, every test. And we had people that never passed that part of the class through the 2 years we were there. So, those are basic things. And so we need to be teaching those basic things. We need to know them ourselves, but then we need to be teaching them to our children so they have a foundation. That's the foundation, really. There's several passages that Paul talked about those that had not left the milk of the word. That's the milk of the word. Once we've built that foundation, we can build upon that into harder things and growing in the truth. And so that's something this generation did not have. They didn't have the foundation. The foundation for them was what God had done for them, the law, things like that. They didn't have it, because if they had that foundation, then they would appreciate and want to grow in their faith. And so we need to remember that. We can learn from this example. We need to be teaching these things to our children to make sure they know and understand them, and help set them up for the life that God wants them to live. And so the next generation. So that was one of the problems they had. Now, let's continue on. Let's see. Somebody want to read verse 11 through 15.
Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord their God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods from among the gods of the people, whom were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord, and they served Baal and the Asheroths. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. So he delivered them into the hands of the plunderers, who despoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord has said, and as the Lord has sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed.
Okay, so the result of verse 10 is now what we see in verse 11 and following. They forgot about God. They didn't care about God. They didn't care to have a relationship with God. And so what did that lead to? Verse 11, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Now, Baals is plural. That's New King James. King James uses Balaam, but it's the plural of Baal. Baal, this is a quote, says, this probably was a sun god that was worshipped in order to have a good weather and fertile fields. Baal worship consisted of ungodly rituals that were designed to increase the generative and reproductive powers of the nation. And so it was a god that was worshipped for fertility of the soil and also of the people, and to grow. And of course that involved very immoral things, as we'll see later. But Baals was a plural of Baal, meaning many different gods. They served different ones. And so it wasn't just Baal, but we see that they also worshipped the gods of the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, all of the different gods that were in the land. And so the Asheroth was mentioned there. That is the female deity, verse 13. It is the plural of Ashereth, and it was a god also that was worshipped for fertility, but it was the female deity of Baal. And so they were enticed. They were enticed by all of this worship that was going on, and these gods, which was crazy. For us to stand here and think about this, why would they do that? God drove all these people out of this nation. He did all this work, this great works for them. He's blessed them so much. Why would they go and worship some idol? It's hard for us. It's interesting. We're talking about this in the teen class. We just looked at this on Wednesday. And, we talk about how it seems crazy to us that people would worship some idol or something that you set up on a table somewhere. But do people today worship the same way? I mean, some do. You think about Hinduism and things like that. But in general thinking here, how do people worship these gods today? What gods do they worship? Let's say that.
I think a lot of, I don't, maybe I'm wrong, but I think a lot of people want physical, that physical appearance of something that they can, you think about the different types or denominations we have, they're really not worshiping in per se God, they're worshiping the Pope and a physical person standing there, just can't,
Something that they can see.
Yeah. Icons.
I think that's like a lot of, to go with what Tara said, a lot of times you see people who claim to be religious wear like a cross or something. I think that fits right in with it, because I'll just call out myself, I have my dad's thumbprint around my neck. Am I ever gonna forget my dad? Absolutely not. But this just kind of makes it feel like he's with me a little bit, even though he never will be until I see him again. But I think people get that kind of way about wearing the cross around their neck. You should just remember that you're a Christian all the time. You shouldn't have to have something to look at or waver.
Which, is the other thing we were talking about with the teen class, is that the thought is if you can't hear, touch, taste, then it's not real. And they want to say, well, God's not real because you can't see him, you can't touch him, you can't, whatever the case may be, within those five senses of scientific reasoning. And so it's to believe in a God that you can't touch, feel, see, whatever, seems, they make fun of it. I mean, our world makes fun of it. TV makes fun of it. And so people are drilled that that's what they have to believe. They have to, if you can't see it, touch, or feel it, then it's not real. And that's foolishness, because something that we can touch, feel, or see cannot make all of this that we have around us. And that's why they want to believe in evolution, that it just happened. But that's not the case. Something more powerful than a F5 tornado, something more powerful than a Cat 5 hurricane. I think about those because there's so much power in those. Something had to create that was more powerful and destructive than that, and that's God. And so, we look at these gods that they wanted to worship here. Not only was it, and I didn't think about that, the fact that they could have something physical, but their worship was enticing because of the things that were going on. It fulfilled some lust and things that were going on, and they saw that worship and they wanted to be a part of it. But there's just this foolishness in that idolatry. I want to go to here because I've talked about this passage many times, but Isaiah 44. And I want to read this because I keep referring to this, and we've not read the passage. But Isaiah 44, Isaiah deals with this idolatry. I'm going to read this, verse 9 through verse 20. It's quite a lengthy reading, but it's interesting. Isaiah 44, getting the right passage here, verse 9 through 20. So it says, those who make an image of them are useless, and their precious things shall not profit. They are their own witnesses, and they neither see nor know that they may be ashamed. Who would form a god or mold an image that profits him nothing? Surely all his companions would be ashamed. And the workmen, they were mere men. Let them all be gathered together. Let them stand up, and they shall fear. They shall be ashamed together. The blacksmith with his tongs works one in the coals, fashions it with hammers, and it works it with the strength of his arms. And so he is hungry, and his strength fails. He drinks no water, and is faint. The craftsman stretches out his rule. He marks one with chalk. He fashions it with a plane. He marks it out with a compass. It makes it like a figure of a man, according to the beauty of a man, that it may remain in the house. He cuts down cedars for himself and takes the cypress and the oak. He secures it for himself among the trees of the forest. He plants a pine, and the rain nourishes it. Then it shall be for a man to burn, for he will take some of it and warm himself. Yes, he kindles it and makes bread. He indeed makes a god and worships it. He makes it a carved image and falls down to it. He burns half of it in the fire. With his half he eats meat. He roasts a roast and is satisfied. He even warms himself and says, I am warm. I have set the fire. And the rest of it he makes into a god, his carved image. He falls down before it and worships it, prays to it, and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." They do not know nor understand, for he has shut their eyes so they cannot see, and their hearts so they cannot understand. And no one considers in his heart, nor is there knowledge nor understanding to say, "I have burned half of it in the fire. Yes, I have also baked bread on its coals. I have roasted meat and eaten it. And shall I make the rest of it into an abomination? Shall I fall down before a block of wood?" He feeds on ashes, and deceived heart has turned him aside. And he cannot deliver his soul, nor say, "Is there not a lie in my right hand?" I really like this, and Isaiah says this, because he says, this man goes out and he cuts down this tree that has been watered by something else, which was God. And it grew in the ground that God had put it there, and put for it. And he takes it and he burns half of it to warm himself, and he makes a fire to cook some food, and then he bows down and worships it and says, "Deliver me," as if that piece of wood was what did all that for him. Who did that for him? Yeah. And so it doesn't make sense. And we look at this and we say, well, this is crazy. This is the kind of gods that they're bowing down and worshiping. It's something that was made with man's hands. But think about it in today's terms. What do people not literally bow down to, but what do people worship today? Okay? Their self. That's a big one. That's a big one. Where is their trust? Okay, government, yeah, worship government sometimes. You think about self, they worship themselves in the sense of they trust in themselves. They don't trust anyone else. They don't trust in God, of course. And so they trust in government. So when government fails, what happens to their joy? What happens to their happiness? It goes with it. Yeah. We talked about the stock market. The stock market crashed back in the early 1900s. How many people committed suicide because of that stock market crash? Because where was their God? It was in the money. When the money went away, what happened to their God? They thought it was gone, right? They thought there was no hope anymore. Do people, where we put our trust, you think about it, we put our trust in physical things. If those physical things disappear, which can happen at any moment, what happens to our focus? What happens to our I'm trying to think of the right word, our trust, our hope? It's gone, right? But if we put our trust and hope in God, who does not fail us, who does not disappear, who does not go away, what happens to our hope and our trust when we lose our physical things? Keeps going, right?
You can have the attitude, well, this stinks, but we'll keep going.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be disappointing, but you don't let it control you.
Yeah. Because you think about it, we think it's crazy this person go take this piece of wood and make this image and cook and all these things and for them, and they bow down and worship it, and we say, well, that's crazy. But how many people love money and trust in money and do the same thing? They go buy them things. It takes care of them. It pays their bills. But when it goes, and then they'll bow down and worship it, not literally, but spend all of their time and focus upon that money and that gain. And when it disappears, it's gone. And so is their hope and trust. It's the same thing. And you can put that with anything. Anything that we put before God becomes our God. Whatever it is, activities, physical things, people, social media, yeah. Huh?
For our kids, they depend on all those likes.
Yeah.
And then when it goes
Popularity.
away and they don't have anything left, that's, I think, a lot of our suicide issues.
Yeah, it does. It does. Our world is focused upon influencers and stuff, and what are they're out there for? They're out there for the likes, the popularity, and when that goes away, then you see videos of them being depressed and things like that because they've lost that. We think it's crazy when we read about the Israelites, but today our world is not any different. People trust and focus and put their hope in things that just like they did. RG?
The Old Testament, the ones that worship the unknown God,
Yeah. We're going to talk about this a little bit too later, but Israelites, when the kingdom was divided, Jeroboam put up a calf in Dan and Beersheba down in the south, and they bowed down and worshipped it and said, that's the true God, that's God. So they were worshiping God, but they weren't worshiping him correctly, they weren't doing it in the way that they should. And not only that, it's kind of like denominationalism today. They say they worship God, but they're not doing it in the right way. And so yeah, the unknown God, same thing. So this is definitely something we can learn from. And the Israelites were enticed by these gods. What entices us today to go serve these gods of physical things, gods of popularity, like actors, whatever the case may be, influencers and things like that? What causes us to do that? Similar things. And so they were enticed to go chase these gods, and it became a test for them. And we're going to see that at the end of the chapter. And so we can learn from that. So verse 12, going back to our study in Judges chapter 2, verse 12, it says, and they forsook the Lord God of their fathers who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. And so they provoked God to anger. Somebody read Matthew 6 and verse 24.
No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon.
Okay, so they wanted to serve these other gods, but I think they liked the blessings that God gave them, right? They liked the fact that they were in this nation that was safe to them and things like that. And so here, they were trying to serve two gods, and it didn't work. Anything that we put as before God as a priority is our small g God. And so they followed these gods because they were able to do what they wanted. It's about their desire. Their desire was to do some of the things that these other nations were doing. We see that later on, right? What did they want to be like the other nations and have? A king. So they had these desires. Instead of controlling those desires and putting their focus upon God, they chose to indulge in those desires. And this idol worship did that. To be righteous, we have to take out self, right, first. We put God first. And so their idolatry, as we talked about, was a mix of a lot of sexual perversions. And it enticed the Israelites to follow in that. And so I think about Balaam and his donkey, right? During that time, the king wanted to destroy the Israelites. He saw them as a great nation that were getting protected. And what was the advice given to him? To have them worship their gods. And it did. It caused a lot of problems for Israel because of it. And so verse 13 says, they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Asheroth, and the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. So he delivered them into the hand of the plunderers who despoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of the enemies all around, so they could no longer stand before their enemies. We talked about this a little bit in that teen class on Wednesday, but when you think about it, we talk about the judges and them going into bondage and being put into servitude. What also was included? When a nation would go against another nation, what was going to happen to some of the people? They're going to die. Not only were they just put into servitude, but many of them lost their lives because of it, right? The consequences of that. And so that would have happened here also. And so God's anger was strong against them. The word anger here was a form of the word nostrils, or it's that idea of a breathing fire. We think about dragons, the depiction of dragons where they have fire coming out of their nostrils. That is the picture of anger here. It's that fire coming out of God's nostrils. He is so angry. He is so angry with what they have done and what they are doing. And so because of his anger, because his anger was very hot, he delivered them into the hand of the spoilers. He sold them into the hands of their enemies. And not only that, they could no longer stand before their enemies. What does that mean about their situation and their enemies before then? Who was really protecting them? Who was really delivering or destroying the people before them? God was. So the moment God said, you know what? You have decided to not serve me. You've decided to serve these other gods. I'm now not protecting you. And immediately, those nations now overpowered them. Because who was really in control of that situation? God was. What could happen to our nation today? Same thing. God can say, you know what? That's it. And because God is one who's ultimately in control, right? God puts into place the powers that be. And so God is in control. And so when we forget about God, we turn our back on God, God can say, that's it. And it's not our power, it's not what we do that makes the outcome. Because I think we mentioned this a couple weeks ago, can't remember, and it's been a few weeks, but what happened to the Israelites when they were told they were not going into the wilderness and some of them decided to do it anyways? Or not wilderness, but into the promised land. When they were told they're not going to go in the promised land for 40 more years, what happened to the ones that tried to go anyways? They were defeated because God was not with them. God was in control of that situation. And so the same thing happened here, and they learned that. And so God's anger was strong against them. And so what did God do? He withdrew from helping them. Israel could not, without God, drive out these nations. From this point forward, they would never drive these nations out because God said, I'm going to leave them here to be a test for you. Notice that in verse 15, or 14 and 15. It says, whenever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed because of it. And so, in a sense, God turned them over to those nations, right? To do what they wanted in the first place, right? But then to suffer the consequences of it. Somebody read Romans 1, 24 through 28.
Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due.
All right, so the same picture is given there in Romans chapter 1. They decided to turn their backs on God. They started to worship the creation more than the Creator. That's the same thing. Worshiping what is created, which is the physical things, instead of worshiping the one who created all things, who ultimately is powerful of all and has the power of all things. They decided to put other things before Him. And so what does God do? What does it say there?
So I forgot to read 28. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a
There you
debased mind to do those things which are not fitting.
Okay, that's said in similarly in verse 26 too. But yeah, verse 28 reinforces the fact that when they turned their backs on God, what did God allow them to do? Let them do it. Okay? And you continue reading the rest of the chapter, there's a lot of desires and things that you got to get involved in. The same things we see here. We didn't read the whole chapter, but you can read it. And so when they wanted to do it, they wanted to get rid of God, God said, okay, you can. But they're going to also suffer the consequences of it, right? And that's exactly what we see here. They wanted to do this. They didn't want to follow God. They wanted to do these evil things. And so God allowed them to. But because of that, they're going to suffer the consequences for it. And they did. over and over again. And as we see, they got worse and worse and worse. If you read through the book of Judges, they never learned their lesson. And it's really not until the time of David we really see the greatness of this nation again. And then in the time of Solomon and some later. It's pretty sad. And so we got to be careful today, because we could do the same thing. We can easily slip into that state of wanting to fulfill what we want and not serving God, and God's going to let us go because we have free will. And so God warned them, but they still chose to do it. And so let's see, we're pretty much out of time. I think we'll stop here because verse 16 is going to start another thing here, talking about the judges. Any good questions or comments? All right, we'll pick up here, verse 16. My note takers back there keep track of it.